Okay, perfect. I think I got a notification that says I'm recording the call.
Yeah, it's yes. I see.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting, and it's our all things Eastern Europe edition. I'm rejoined by my returning champion and someone whose insights and real journalism I really value and appreciate. Back on the program is Polish independent journalist Malgorzata Kulbaczewka-Figat, the often co-host and moderator of Crossborder Talks, contributor and often a guest on the Barricade, a pan-Eastern European news outlet that offers a critical left perspective on Eastern European and global affairs, and is a frequent contributor and editor of Transform Europe. And she's my guest. So first off, Malgorzata, welcome back to the program.
Hello, so good to be here again. I knew you would invite me again. So...
Well, you know me, Malgorzata. I love your journalism, and we always seek out the most underrated and often criminally overlooked voices on all sorts of topics. So yes, thank you for coming back on the program. And yes, and let's get into what I wanted to talk to you about, which is my first question is, talk to us about this recent article of yours about Polish transportation workers taking a leap of faith and going on strike. Tell us, what's this all about?
So, by the end of June and at the first half of July, so quite recently, the workers of the city communication, so the bus and tram drivers in the city of Bydgoszcz, that is in the northern part of Poland, decided their wages were too low and that nobody wanted to talk to them about that, and so they staged a wild strike, or as they put it, a rebellion of communication workers. Why I say it is wild, why it is important, why it is a historical event. It is very important for Polish workers movement, or more widely in the workers movement in the whole Central Europe, basically because it was wild. It was the event in which the workers defied the anti-trade union legislation we have that actually makes the organization of a strike an enterprise that takes months or even a whole year. So just let me give you a brief introduction. In Poland, if you want to go on strike, you need to undergo a series of stages so that your industrial action can be considered legal. First, you go to negotiate with your employer. If this fails, you invite a mediator from outside. If this fails too, you need to write down a protocol of your differences, which can take weeks too, because it is your employer can question what you write down in your protocol. Only then you must ask the workers if they want to go on strike. Not an easy task if you have a big rotation of people, or if the people work on multiple shifts. So only if you succeed to get more than a half of the staff to vote, and only if more than a half of the voting people stand for the strike, you can start preparing your industrial action. This is ridiculously complicated, as you can see, and a lot of trade union organizations have actually given up an idea of going on strike because they felt they would not just go all through these multiple stages. And those who did strike prepared for this for many months, as I said. We had a very big industrial strike in Solaris, the bus factory at the beginning of the year, and the collective and the action, the protest, the preparation process took more than 6 months, if not longer.
Wow.
So these brave guys in Bydgoszcz decided that, if there is an inflation now in Poland more than 15%, and that if nobody wants to talk to them about any wage rises, and if there is not enough bus drivers, and even this does not stimulate local government to talk to them, then there is no point to go through all these stages. They simply stopped the vehicles, they blocked the places where the vehicles are stationed after the courses. And they said that if the local government does not see any problem in their wages, then let the president of Bydgoszcz come and work for 3,000 zlotys, which is less than 1,000 euros. So then the protest did not stop after a day out or two, but it lasted the whole 14 days, so 2 weeks without public transport in a big city in northern Poland.
Wow.
And
Go on.
yes, and of course it was not fruitless. If it brought them a partial victory, I would say. They asked for to get a pay rise of 1,000 zlotys. That is, as I said, if now €1 is worth around 4.5 Polish zlotys, so you can count it. And in the end, they got like 1/3 of what they fought for, which may not sound very impressive at first, but then let us think, these people asked for pay rises for years. And so 2 weeks of a collective solidarity action was enough to make the local government realize that the problem is serious. And why I'm thinking that this event is historical, first of all, because the workers showed the solidarity and they showed that they are really determined to fight even by bypassing the law regulation. And secondly, I know already that there are cities that are going to follow this example. Unfortunately, this is not my city of Katowice, which has basically the same problem, but I know that there are at least 4 places in Poland where the drivers were following the news from Bydgoszcz and where they were indeed planning to go to their own industrial action too. So, just to give you a little bit more of a Eastern European context, this is, we see that Poland, while being a reactionary country still with our right-wing government, is a kind of becoming the center of the now Central European workers' movements. It seems that a lot of people now in the situation of the wages stagnating, but the prices going high, a lot of people in Poland are now rediscovering what is industrial action, what is a strike, and that perhaps nationalistic propaganda is not something that will suffice in these conditions. So it turns out that there is a lot of groups of really angry workers, starting from those employed in the industry, through those who work in like communication and transport services, and even finishing with such groups as teachers or other state officials. The teachers went on a huge strike like 3 years ago. The strike did not bring anything significant due to the behavior of their trade union, but now we see that this anger is reaching more and more groups, and Polish government will probably have a problem, as their whole narrative their whole narration over the last couple of years was that they were a party of common people, a party that that allows an average Pole raise their standard of living. Now, with inflation, the standard of living is actually going down, and they will have to answer somehow to this popular anger that is growing. So far, I can't see really any serious answer on their side, as Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki has been touring Poland now, talking to different meeting people and saying such phrases as I can quote more or less what he said 2 days ago in Kędzierzyn-Koźle and in the south of Poland. He said basically, we are a patriotic party caring for everybody. If we can't solve a problem in one moment, then we think and finally come up with a solution. You know.
Okay. Should be easy to win him over then, right?
Yeah.
But then I have to ask then this follow-up question, which is what is the name of the union leading the strike, and is the the sort of pseudo left solidarity trade union supporting these actions, or any other workers outside of this sector supporting the striking public transportation workers?
The thing is that there was no big trade union that actually incited this protest or called to the protest. And Solidarity trade union group actually played a very dubious role. Solidarity in the second week of the protest, when everybody saw that the things are really serious, Solidarity actually said that they they are not going against the industrial bargaining law, so they don't support this form of action, and that the workers should have actually gone through all these stages that I elaborated before. So the action was largely spontaneous. It was largely organized by the drivers themselves, and it gained the support of different trade unions only in the course of events. Indeed, another trade union organizations like OPZZ or the All Poland Trade Union Confederation or the Forum of Trade Unions, or a small but radical group that is called Inicjatywa Pracownicza or the Workers' Initiative. All these groups actually rushed to support the workers. They helped to set a meeting in the center of the city. So yes, they supported the workers, but the fantastic thing is that the action was to large extent spontaneous. It was a grassroots action. So we can see that really the Polish workers are starting to see that they can take things into their hands. And this is great. As well, we were basically taught in Poland all under these 3 decades of crazy capitalism that the best thing you can do is to set up a company. So
yeah, exactly.
Yes. And and that going on strikes is actually the worst thing you can do, because if you are unhappy with your job, just go find another job and that's it. So it's really motivating to see that people now start to realize how absurd was all that. Yes, and another motivating thing is that the strike was met with positively with other group of workers and also by people living in Bydgoszcz. When journalists from local media asked the locals what do they think about the buses standing idle on the stops, they basically said that the workers have the right to protest. That if their wages were low, so they wished them good luck actually. And the city government, the local government tried to switch this sympathy to their own side. They were trying to persuade people that the workers are actually interrupting the normal life of the city, and that now the town must spend a lot of money to organize a kind of substitute communication. But the people actually turned out more understanding than those who are supposed to run the city. The people actually understood that if you feel that your wages are so low, then you have the right to protest. Also, there were solidarity, like other trade unions expressed solidarity with the strikers, and there was some knowledge sharing, experience sharing between the drivers and the Solaris crew. These guys who said the historic 6-week-long strike in Solaris factory. So I don't want to go too optimist. It is still not the case that we have like a mass working movement in Poland, but something is changing really. A couple of years ago, I could have not imagined such things. Now we see one industrial action after another, and we see that the workers are genuinely inspired by those who had striked and who had won before. So like the information sharing is not a myth, it really happens.
That's fantastic, and one can only hope that it continues to escalate and it works in favor of not just the Polish workers, but the Polish left. Then I have to ask, because you mentioned local media. So how has corporate and state media been presenting, and do many passengers and others who are burned out by endless austerity, fed up with the far right politics, and even those who foolishly keep voting for parties like Law and Justice and other socially regressive, fiscally backward folks, are they also are they all, also supporting the striking public transportation workers and drivers?
Well, the whole thing put the media, the corporate media, in quite a difficult position. The corporate media, basically in Poland we have now two groups of big media. One is the Western-owned corporate media who sympathize for the neoliberal opposition and who stand vehemently against our right-wing conservative government. And they were put in a difficult position because the strikers actually acted against the local government, which is headed by a neoliberal guy from their favorite opposition party. So they were pretty skeptical about the strike. They did not dare to say that, for example, the workers are hooligans or something like this, which is a sign of time in itself, because a couple of years ago it was standard to say that the trade unions are just lazy people, and
Yeah.
They like stick to just fact reporting. They were writing that the buses stand, the trams don't go, people demand for pay rises. Dot. Finished. Yeah, point. And
Okay.
the right-wing media, the other group of the media that is either state-owned, now government-controlled, or private right-wing nationalistic media, they emphasize the thing that the local government is not the real national one, but rather this neoliberal opposition. They don't use the term neoliberal, but they like saying that this is anti-human and pro-market party. And so they even suggested that the workers' fight was legitimate. And
So it's been a bit of a mixed bag then.
yes, the local media were actually the most honest in all that, because they wrote that the transportation in Bydgoszcz was on low level, basically due to these low wages, that many bus courses were actually recalled because there were not enough drivers, and that people really expected that such a protest may take place at one moment. So it seems that the corporate media were again proved how they disfigure the reality instead of saying what is really going on.
Interesting. And then I have to also ask this: do you think if the workers are brave enough and if they continue to gain enough popular support, not just amongst the Polish masses, but across the Eastern European region, and left movements in Europe like DiEM25, the Pan-European EU Left Reformist Project of Janusz Varoufakis, that this could become an issue impossible to ignore, and if the workers win? Do you think that'll be setting hopefully a positive trend across Eastern Europe and hopefully the rest of Europe then?
Well, I can see that one positive trend can already be observed. In the last decade, we saw a wave of reindustrialization of Poland and other Central European countries because the Western companies were moving their factories here. And this is actually still taking place. And for the first years, everybody was basically happy in Poland that there are some jobs, that some new jobs appear. The Western factories usually appeared in the places that used to be industrialized, where there used to be some factories but before the transformation, which were then closed, sold, and destroyed. And the people were happy that there are some new jobs. They also thought that perhaps the Western businessmen will be more human than Polish employers, who are very nasty.
And so they were hoping that the Western multinationals would be better than whatever grievances they had with the Polish communist government. You mean?
Yes, exactly. And now we see that this trend is like we see a new trend. Basically, people see that if Polish workers, I think, started to see how important they are to the factories. They gained this self-conscience that there will be no production without them, and that their voice must be taken into account. So we had two huge strikes this year in these like Western-owned big factories, but we had a whole series of these collective protests that were actually ended on the early stage without strike because the employers actually gave up, because they actually agreed to give pay rises before this final phase was reached. So not far away from the place where I am located in Tychy, that is southern of Katowice, there is a huge automotive company. I don't remember what Western brand is this, but the thing I want to say is that they were also having an industrial barricade. They were also having a conflict there. They started negotiating, and already on the stage of the negotiations, the company agreed to give them higher salaries. This is a huge influence of the strikes that actually took place. And here I think that Poland can be a kind of inspiration to neighboring countries as the biggest country in the Central Europe, as the country where this reindustrialization process is also naturally most advanced, because we have all these transport connections to Germany. We are located in the center of Europe, so we're kind of a dream location for these Western relocalizing people. So I think we could be an inspiration to other countries too. The thing that we need to work on are the cross-border connections between trade union in Poland and other countries of Central Europe. This had been quite abandoned. Not entirely abandoned, but not seen as a priority direction by most of Polish trade unions. And this is something we need to catch up with, as I know that there are activists in Central Europe that are actually inspired by what is happening in Poland. So
continue.
Yeah, and I think I need to mention here is also that the Polish government is already starting to realize that in the autumn it may face even stronger resistance from the side of the workers, and that's why they are trying to change the law on collective bargaining and industrial action. And the changes they suggested are actually not promising. They are going to complicate the procedure of an industrial action even more. For the changes, basically the changes consists of the core of the change is to deprive the smaller trade unions of their right to initiate a collective action. Right now, you can even if you are only a small trade union, you can start the process I described earlier in your factory. If you are supported by people who are not belonging to the union and they allow you to lead this industrial action, this is possible. If the changes are introduced, this will be no longer possible because only the biggest trade unions will be authorized to start industrial action. Why is this important? Well, basically because of many of the big trade unions, with the infamous example of Solidarity, whose behavior is truly disgusting over the last few years. Many of these big trade unions are actually living on a good term with the employers, both public and private companies, and they are not really keen on going on to some really radical industrial actions. Like I could name a couple of places like the State Post of Poland or education sector, where Solidarity trade unions were actually discouraging workers from going on strike, or they were conducting negotiations with the employer in such a way that in the end the negotiations lasted for months, and in the end the workers got like 10 euro pay rise. So you'd see it is ridiculous. And the government is clearly counting on this new legislation to eliminate more radical groups from like organizing workers. But the result, I think, and I am even more sure of that after the Bydgoszcz experience, can be exactly the opposite. more workers can be encouraged just to go on an illegal strike without seeing that if there is no representative, they can just take things in their own hands. Everything depends now, I would say, on a personal factor. If there would be skilled and brave people in particular locations that would be like able to persuade other staff to go with them, and that striking can actually bring them more profit than sitting silent. Well, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there was an interesting documentary called The Take, done by Naomi Klein and her husband Avi Lewis, which was about the Argentinian financial banking crisis and how so many factories were shutting down, and then the workers, instead of just getting their pay slips and then going into the world of chronic unemployment, they actually took matters into their own hands and continued working in the factories and sort of modeling themselves on the the anarchist communities during the Spanish Civil War. And that's great to hear that in Poland workers are defying the class collaborationist attitude of Solidarity and other of the big trade unions. So one can only hope that continues. And has there been any coverage outside of Poland in neighboring Eastern European countries, or even in Western Europe? Because I was asking, if Janusz Varoufakis and if his organization has been standing in solidarity, not with Solidarity, but with the Polish public transportation workers as they address their grievances.
Oh, do you mean if the other media actually covered the whole thing? Or
yes, other media in Eastern Europe, and if organizations like DiEM25 have been showing any solidarity to the striking Polish workers.
Well, the events, the course of events actually surprised everybody, including the left-wing activists in Poland itself. Only after a couple of days, they started to organize solidarity pickets in Bydgoszcz, or only after a couple of days when the local media reported on the whole thing, there was some reaction from the Social Democrats in Poland. And not to mention our neighbors or the left-wingers from somewhere else. Actually, here I must say also that, as far as I know, one of the biggest social democratic parties in Poland, that is Nowa Lewica, actually did not even react to the events. Their smaller partner, that is the Razem party, they did stand with the workers, so that was the good point for them.
Interesting.
But I am not aware of any public statement of these bigger, the new left politicians even commenting on the issue. Perhaps they are all on vacation. Well, and
that goes to show. But do you think that's a sign, though, that the left in general, institutionally, is still very weak, and that it's up to the people themselves to come up from like a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach to take matters into their own hands to address all of these grievances that the Polish working class and others have?
I guess that there is still a problem in communication between trade unions, between workers, and between left-wing, I would say professional politicians or young activists.
Okay.
The thing is not that the second group does not want to work with the first, quite the opposite. Polish left is often accused of being only pro-LGBT, pro-ecology, liberal, but no. People on the left, on the social democratic left that I know, and including the parliament, the members of parliament from the Together or Razem party, they are actually pretty pro-worker. They feel it is their duty to be with the workers. The problem is that most of these left-wing activists actually come from middle class, or, well, it is dubious to use the term middle class in Poland, but let's say intellectual
struggling middle class background, though.
Yes, like like urban groups, people working in services, not really the industrial working class. And the link between Polish Social Democrats and these working people was broken at the beginning of 21st century after the Social Democratic government introduced the most awful austerity policies we have seen in Poland over last decades. The workers first voted the Social Democrats and then they got so viciously betrayed. So that was the moment when this connection was definitely broken, and the new Social Democratic parties are still unable to restore it. So the problem is that right now, if workers go on strike somewhere in Poland, usually they get the support from the Social Democratic Party. They usually get the support from local activists and possibly even from the parliament members who come and declare their support. But the thing is that the initiative is always going from below, and that no long-term strategy is being worked out. It is like the left activists understood that they must stand on the side of the workers, but they wait for the workers to say, please come here and there, or please support us in this particular case. And not much is really done to draft a kind of long-term strategy. Well,
Yeah.
I remember even asking one of the left-wing MPs if they are planning to try to draft a bill on this collective bargaining, which would actually, reform the strike procedure, because many trade unions say this actually prevents them from going on strike. And the answer was pretty ambiguous. They said, the guy with whom I was talking said that we would do that if somebody asks us, or if the trade unions come with a draft, then we could bring it to the parliament. So you see, not really, not really an initiative on their side. And I think, though, that this may be changing too with time, as a lot of young people are now supporting the left in Poland. A lot of young people are going to this direction, particularly young women. And many of them have not only the experience of living in an atmosphere of Catholic nationalist propaganda, but also their experiences from the work, from their first jobs. Like, a lot of young people are getting their first job in services, like in working as waiters, or in call centers, or something like that. And these first experiences are usually really awful. So we can imagine that in the coming years, young people, or even now, young people will be pressing the left to make this work experience a central point in the program, because this is really something they experience.
Fantastic. And that's a perfect segue then to my second to last question, which is now recently now explain, because recently in an article you did about Ukraine, changing the subject for a bit, you did an article about Ukraine and the overlooked and criminally underreported topic of Zelensky's authoritarianism. And I know Boyan of the Barricade, your colleague, talked about how Zelensky's been shutting out all opposition from other right-wing parties, left-wing parties, and even media which isn't behind him. But you talked, but you did an article specifically about workers' rights in Ukraine. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the article I wrote it, I guess, in a couple of months ago, and since then the situation got even worse, because we found out the Ukrainian government's plan for reconstruction of the country, and we could get an insight into their heads with a programmatic text of the Ministry of Economy, in which the minister outlined what is her view of a successful economy. And guess what? 30 years after the catastrophic transition in Eastern Europe, this woman claims that the key to success is less state in economy, is more freedom for business, less guarantees for working people, because it is an obstacle for successful business. And basically she said even something like, we are going to employ the principle of a free step. As Ukraine is often associated with steps, so this will be like free space for business. And as she continues, in this free area, the business will be doing everything they want, apart from endangering others' personal freedom and bringing a danger to the state's security. Well, everything else, the exploitation of workers, all these things is apparently beneficial to Ukrainian society. And coming back to the regulations about which I talked to the activists of the Ukrainian Socjalny Ruch organization, Socjalny Ruch or social movement in English. Well, the new legislation that is being introduced in the shade of war actually suggests that in companies that employ less than 200 people, the employer will be able to shape the work contract in whatever way he would like to. He could write there everything. He could write extra reasons for firing a worker. He could suggest some other organization of the working week, that the standard like five days, 8 hours. There would be also another bill that has already been voted, allows employers not to pay if they prove that the company was somehow influenced by the war. So you can work and then you get no payment, because no salary, because the employer stated that the company could not work properly in war conditions.
Wow.
Well, I can imagine that some of the factories, some of the workplaces were indeed destroyed. As we have war, we have the cities under fire, and some of the industrial complexes indeed got in the very center of military action. But this law is written in such a way that everybody could use it to stop payments for the workers. The employer is not even supposed to prove that his factory was actually destroyed. So, and one important thing to understand the whole thing. The legislation I was talking about first, so this extra flexibility in small and medium enterprises up to 200 employers, is not a new idea. Actually, it was elaborated already 2 years before the war, or even a little bit, definitely before 24th of February. And it was suggested to the government by a kind of think tank that was set up by no one else than Mikhail Saakashvili. So a pro-European and pro-Western think tank advocating some liberalizing laws for Ukraine. At that time, however, the government did not feel confident enough even to put it under a vote, even to promote the idea. They simply knew there would be protests, there would be demonstrations in Kyiv and elsewhere. So they just read it with interest and left it for better times. And so the better times came. The times when Ukrainian workers are really fighting, they are defending, most of the Ukrainian workers indeed are now supporting the defense of the country in this or other way. Most of these people have no doubts that their duty is to defend Ukraine. What is the government doing? It is basically destroying any guarantees for working people. It is they used as I said, the Minister of Economy used the metaphor of the free step. I would employ another historical term. There was a period in our common Polish-Ukrainian history where Ukraine, Kiev, and the lands even to the east were actually part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this area, which is today central Ukraine, was known as the Wild Fields. It was called Wild Fields because, like, you know, the peasants who could escape there, and they started living as free people. Though everybody who was really unhappy with his life elsewhere in Poland or Lithuania could try to escape there, join others, and so the organization of the Zaporozhian Cossacks started to emerge. So what is the Ukrainian government trying to turn his country into are those wild fields for business, where those who have capital will win and those who are not, without capital and connections will perish in the steppe, basically.
Is Zelensky is Zelensky's rationale for doing this, and of course he can easily pass this regressive law because he's shut down opposition, both left-wing opposition and right-wing opposition. But is Zelensky's rationale for this that, hey, we're at war, these are not normal times, therefore this is a state of emergency, and we have to pass laws like this in order to continue to let the country to keep the country rolling while we're having this war with Russia. And just for people who don't know, Mikhail Saakashvili was the former president of Georgia after Georgia went through a color revolution and communism was overthrown, and he was a classic free marketeer, disaster capitalist, libertarian. He fled the country when there was investigations into corruptions and conflicts of interest, and then he became a Ukrainian national and is behind a lot of the color revolutions that have been happening in Ukraine, leading to the current crisis that we face now. So I had to explain that. But my main question is Zelensky's rationale for doing this because these are not normal times because of the war and stuff like that, and therefore I have to pass these regressive laws while shutting down opposition?
Well, one remark about opposition being shut down. There was no genuine left-wing opposition in Ukraine anyway. Many of the parties who were shut down bore names like Left Unity or Socialist Party, something like this, but I have met
the Communist Party of Ukraine.
But in fact, most of those groups were either totally irrelevant for any political and social lives, or they were just, I don't know, mistaking an intensive pro-Putin views with what is socialism, or they were mistaking a kind of Soviet nostalgia and pro-Russian sentiment with what is socialism. And well, of course, closing down opposition parties looks absolutely bad. And if Ukraine aspires to be a democracy, this is a really dubious move. But we just need to know the proportions. It is not that Zelensky was shutting down a vibrant socialist or social democratic opposition. In fact, there were hardly any groups in Ukraine actually standing for implementing socialist ideas in social life, which this is an absolute paradox because even like 10 years ago, when Ukrainians were asked about what they think about socialism and the socialism era and the Soviet era, a lot of people had very good memories of that, like stable jobs, like big factories that ensured holidays also for people working there, like public housing, all this stuff that ensures a decent standard.
And these are Ukrainians with living who lived throughout the period, who did not move and become part of those regressive expat communities, right?
Yeah. And however, as I said, there was no representations of these people with probably left-wing sympathies or with even with an instinct for some social justice. Instead, we had in Ukraine either some oligarchical parties run by the business tycoons, or no, some small groups that, as I said, who confused nostalgia with fighting for workers' rights. So the genuine left-wing opposition to Zelensky is yet to be developed in Ukraine. There are some trade unions, there is the group of Socjalny Ruch that I mentioned, so there is something to build upon, but still they need to grow in strength and to strengthen their political profile. And now coming to your question, you asked, is it rational for Zelensky now to push this regressive, this anti-human legislation? Well, if you look at Zelensky and his team, for me, there are two explanations of their behavior. Either they are so, on one side, I think they understand that they are now dependent on Western support for Ukraine. According to American military experts, now Ukraine has basically exhausted its own and military technique supplies. If there are no more arms supplies coming from the West, then the war is lost for them. But the military situation is only one aspect on which Ukraine is dependent on the West. Ukraine's situation would have been much worse, economical situation, I mean, hadn't millions of Ukrainians already emigrated from the country. Working in Poland, first of all. Secondly, Ukrainian economy has been more or less a disaster since the transition, where the huge Soviet factories were basically sold to oligarchs or given to oligarchs for nothing. And yes, to people who were watching the defense of Mariupol, the whole battle of Mariupol, you must have heard about Azovstal and earlier the Illich factory, another huge industrial complex there. Imagine that both of them actually belonged to one person. They were privatized and they were in hands of one Ukrainian oligarch. And the same goes for other huge industrial complexes that were built under Soviet period and then sold. So this economy just could not work properly. And with all the wealth of the country being in hands of some really dubious figures, how can Ukraine as a state work properly? And Zelensky, now the question is Zelensky sincere in his belief that neoliberalism is the way, and that if Ukraine can become a successful area for small and medium business, which he likes saying, or that his minister likes saying, or is he entirely saying just what the West expects from him? I can imagine that this is a mixture of this personal and objective factor. For really, nobody in Ukraine presented really a valid alternative for neoliberal economy. And the European Union also did not provide them with any other scenarios of development. So how can left-wing consciously thinking economists appear in Ukraine from nowhere? Of course, there are some people who have alternative ideas, but you can't really get this rationally thinking, not neoliberal economist in the mainstream if from everywhere Ukraine is pushed to this neoliberal path by everybody, by the US, by the European Union, also by Poland, because when Poland sent their advisors to Ukraine after 2014, we really sent the most awful neoliberal people there. So really it is, and I can only blame European Union now that when this plan of reconstruction was presented for Ukraine, there was nobody in Europe who told them don't go this way. You are basically going to repeat all the mistakes of Poland, of Slovakia, or other Central European countries. You could come to Poland or to your neighbors and ask how the transition looked like, and just don't go this way. However, European countries are actually happy with what Ukrainians are going to do. European capital is happy with the possible new markets. And I can only feel sorry for Ukrainians. I can feel only terribly sorry for Ukrainian people who gave examples for bravery, who gave example of steadfastness, and who are now again to be betrayed in the worst possible way.
Unbelievable. And this just goes to show you why we really do need a strong left, and why we do need a left to wake up from its coma across the world to push back against these regressive policies. And last question I wanted to ask you, turning this over a bit to in a more global context, is how was Pride Month in Poland, and your thoughts on the Supreme Court of the U.S. overturning abortion? And are people power movements in Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, who are gripped by reactionary right-wing forces, much of it exported by the U.S. and Canada and so forth, are they worried that there's going to be more regressive laws towards women, the working class majority, and the queer and the Roma community? Curious your thoughts about that.
Well, I must say that the overturning of Roe versus Wade was met with kind of disbelief in Polish progressive community. We are still living, not me, but a lot of them were still living with a conviction that Joe Biden would somehow not allow to do that. There is little understanding, I think, for how the American legislation and judicial system works and what the Supreme Court of the United States can actually do. So people in Poland, the progressive community in Poland had such a deep sigh of relief after Biden's victory that they are. Oh yeah, yes.
Oh boy, I could have warned them to lower your expectations.
Funny in itself, but yes, they were so happy that Trump is gone. So until now, they thought that nothing bad can really happen, or at least nothing worse than what we had under Trump. Also one important thing is that in Poland it is Russia who is most often accused of supporting the conservative movements, which is of course not entirely false neither, as Vladimir Putin has kept saying that Russia is the defender of conservative values, and that Europe is dying because it opened way for LGBT and the destruction of traditional family. So in Poland, and
he's also described when the British voted to leave the European Union, there was a statement from Putin that, it makes sense. Rich countries don't want to subsidize for a poorer country. So
yeah, exactly. So in Poland, we tend to think that the conservative movements, the anti-abortion movements, would rather have links to Russia and to the ultra-conservative organization that exists around Putin, rather than to some processes that go in the West, in America. Even though one of the most awful Polish conservative Catholic fundamentalist organization has links to a Brazilian foundation that in its turn is a part also of a conservative network in the Americas. So coming back to your question, this was met with disbelief somehow, but also with a feeling that we need to mobilize, we need to strengthen our ranks, and we need to strengthen the network of solidarity and mutual help. There is, as I told you, even after this Polish ban on abortion, a lot of women groups were set up to help people to go abroad and get an abortion, or to get informed how to get an abortion, or how to get pills that are necessary for medical abortion. And this is actually working quite well in Poland. I mean, this is all in the underground, it is all in the semi-official zone, but this network of solidarity do exist and do work. And do we expect more assaults against women's rights? I can say that women in Poland have completely no illusions, neither about our own government or about the capacity of other governments defending our rights. For there are really quite many women in Poland who could not believe why European Union did not do anything about our government depriving us of basic rights. You know, we were quite sure that access to abortion is like a civilizational standard in our part of the world, and that Europe will do something apart from saying no, don't do that. So right now, Polish women seem to believe that really the different governments are against us. The American government also turned out to be more willingly listening to the conservatives, and that everything depends on our self-organizations and our capacities for self-help. So basically, this is that. And you asked me about the Pride Month in Poland. And I can tell you one thing. I think that Pride Month has already become an event that takes place, and nobody is really surprised that it comes. And I would say even 2 years ago, it was a sensation in Poland that smaller cities were having their own pride marches. It was a sensation that cities of, let's say, 100,000 inhabitants or even less were having their parades. Now nobody is really surprised about that. Of course, the right-wingers don't like the events, but we could say that more or less everybody knows that in June there will be Pride Week in Poznań, a huge city in the west of Poland, that there will be the Equality Parade in Warsaw, the first event of this kind, and also that in other cities the same things could happen. And even corporations, the multinationals in Poland are now standing on the side of minorities. So this year's Warsaw Pride was historical also in this sense that the presence of multinationals with banks of Google or everything was really huge. Actually, there were more corporation platforms than the platforms of left-wing groups, which is, yes.
So,
on one hand, it shows that, of course.
So on the one side, it's a good thing that people are more tolerant that Pride events are happening deep in the heart of a far-right fundamentalist Catholic country. But the negative side is what a lot of my queer comrades have been saying to me, that Pride has become way too corporate, and it went from queer liberation, anti-police brutality, to rainbow capitalism, or as I prefer to call it, rainbow crapitalism, right?
Yes, exactly. And there was a debate on that in Polish queer and progressive community, as well as some of the queer people were really unhappy with this parade turning into like I don't know, a set of advertisements for huge companies. But in the end, I think that in the end, the position that we need to be visible and that the LGBT people need to be like normalized still in Poland, it prevailed. So many people joined the parade even having these concerns, or they set up an anti-capitalist bloc that also marched in the parade behind Google and all this stuff. But they were there. In any case, they were there. So I think that these struggles that you mentioned will only intensify as really people are more and more people are involved in these equality movements, and they are bringing their experience, their positions. So things will only be getting more interesting in our ultra-Catholic country.
And of course the one final thing I'll say before we end this is there is hope that there is hope that maybe things will get better. Maybe there will be a light at the end of the far right tunnel because, as you mentioned, young people, particularly Polish women, are the ones leading the way in terms of socialist reformist policies, or progressivism, as as Americans like to say. And so there may be sign of good times to come, even though it seems very bleak because of the far right and the right wing in general keep winning and winning, right?
One thing we must keep in mind: we are living in crisis times, and we are living in a really multi-factored crisis of capitalism. And this crisis hits now everybody in Poland and in Central Europe as well. Not only in Central Europe, but I think that even if our region was living in a stagnation for a decade or more, for more than one decade, now it is time when history accelerates. It is time when people gain conscious faster than in, would say, such as people say, normal times. Really,
Yeah.
things will be changing, not will be changing for the better, and we will all feel that we need alternatives. So this is the optimistic point I could say in the end.
Alrighty. Well, on that optimistic note, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Eastern Europe edition, with Malgorzata Kulbaczewka-Figat of the Barricade, Transform Europe, and Crossborder Talks. Folks, check out her incredible journalism. Check out all of those outlets I mentioned and donate generously to them all. Malgorzata, thank you so much for joining me again. Give my best to your to the team at the Barricade, and I hope we get the chance to speak soon, because there's a lot of other important topics I want to talk to you about. But I think it's best if we have a panel for that. So yeah. So
Wow, thank you, and I'm waiting for next encounter. Thank you, and greetings to everybody who was listening to us.
Likewise, my dear. Best of luck to you, and yes, we'll be in touch.
Yeah.